Well, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us for today's AVERT webinar, what's going to be another informative and insightful event. My name is Lydia Khalil, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's webinar. Today we have Sarah Vetter and Dr. Bettina Rottweiler presenting with us on their recent work on nihilistic violent extremism. Before we get started and before we introduce them, I might take a minute to also speak about the AVERT Research Network, to introduce the network to you, some of you who may be new or joining us for the first time. The AVERT Research Network is the Addressing Violent Extremism and Radicalization to Terrorism Research Network. It's a multidisciplinary research and practitioner network that's based out of Australia, but has a global membership. And you can find out more about our activities, our members, and some of the research that we feature at avert.net.au. But as we said today, we're here really to showcase the work Dr. Bettina Rottweiler and Sarah Vetter, their work on nihilistic violent extremism, which is becoming an ever concerning global threat. We've seen actors within these networks display very fluid violent extremist motivations and encourage and facilitate a broad spectrum of harms, blurring boundaries between violent extremism, organized crime, and child abuse. So this is obviously very concerning, and often those who are involved in these networks are quite young children or young adults, and the vulnerable are frequently targeted. Because there's little empirical evidence that exists, we're really excited to actually introduce their work today, because they have been producing the first ever database on NVE, nihilistic violent extremism. And they will talk about this database, offer us some sort of systematic analysis based on the information that they've gathered about this global database that is out of Insight. And so to introduce a bit more our speakers, today we've got Dr. Bettina Rottweiler, who's Associate Research Professor at Insight, the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology and Education Center. And she leads a portfolio on youth mobilization to violent extremism, including nihilistic violent extremism. And her research focuses on the life course factors, mobilization indicators, and the pathways in which young people become involved in violent extremism. She's also a research fellow at the Zurich Project on the social development from childhood to adulthood. We also have Sarah Vetter, who's a project manager at Insight. And she works at Insight Center at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, supporting many of these projects that bridge research and real-world impact. And to get started on the presentation today, I'm going to throw it first over to Sarah, who will talk to you a little bit about Insight and get our presentation started. Thank you, and welcome, Sarah and Bettina.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I'm one of two project managers here at Insight, that National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology and Education Center. We are based at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and Insight is the leading U.S. research center focused on the study of terrorism and evolving security threats. As the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism, Insight develops research, tools, and training designed to support efforts to prevent and respond to terrorism, transnational crime, and other emerging threats. A key strength of the Insight is our focus on what's changing, identifying and understanding new and evolving threat landscapes. We bring together interdisciplinary teams and collaborate with a network of more than 100 partners, combining expertise across sectors to address complex challenges. We also work closely with the government and defense partners with strengths in analyzing threat actor behaviors, tactics, and potential targets. Our work is broadly organized across three portfolios: threat actors, tactics, and targets. That's our brief overview of Insight, and it is now my pleasure to introduce one of our leading researchers who is tackling the important and complex area of work on nihilistic violent extremism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bettina Rottweiler, who will share more about her research and insights.
You're on mute, Bettina.
classic thing. Hi, everyone. Again, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lydia. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm very excited to be able to present the newest research findings from our nihilistic-oriented violent extremist live course dataset or short novel dataset. So thank you for joining us today. Before we start, I also want to say thank you to the whole youth mobilization team at Insight who spent thousands of hours researching and coding on this project. So a special thank you to them. I also would like to mention two other people who are really central to the success of the project. And that special thank you goes to my senior researcher, Dr. Kelsey Sagala, and my co-PI, Dr. Caitlin Clemmo, based at UCL. And without both of them and my whole team, none of that would be possible. So thank you very much. So I'll start off today's webinar by giving you an overview of Insight's ongoing NVE research. We'll then go over a short case study, which clearly highlights why research on the life course factors is so important in order to have a better understanding how and why certain people, especially young people, become involved in these types of groups. After the case study, we briefly touch upon the challenges we face when trying to study and understand a novel threat like NVE. And then finally, I will introduce the novel dataset. After providing you an overview of the methods and the codebook, I'll present you with the first results that have emerged from our data set. And then we're going to finish off with a short discussion and next steps. So what is Insight doing in terms of NVE research? So overall, we are a team of 14 people focused more broadly in youth radicalization and youth mobilization to violent extremism. Together, we study the different pathways that can draw young people into violent extremism across a range of ideologies and groups. And today's webinar is one of new and emerging threats to young people, which is NVE. The findings presented later are based on 15 months of research undertaken by a large research team and month of coding. Due to our large disciplinary team, we conduct a wide range of research in order to study and tackle the NVE threat. For example, we work closely with Seamus Hughes, who has been central to this work. Seamus helps us track federal and state cases across the US, but also internationally. We also at Insight study the tactics and targets of NVE groups, and we try to identify new emerging trends. And one of our main efforts really is a compilation of the novel dataset, which is an ongoing and continuously updated dataset where we're coding the life course factors, mobilization indicators of US and international NVE people. And in addition to that quantitative work, we conduct in-depth case studies, analyses to get deeper insights into the mechanisms and life course processes that underpin pathways to NVE. And we have a strong end-user focus, so we produce guidance documents and deliver training for law enforcement and policy partners. So I'm sure all of you have heard, at least by today, about nihilistic violent extremism and associated groups like 764. But I always like to start off with a little case study to tell a story and to give some context. As mentioned earlier, this case study really shows why research on the life course factors is crucial to understand pathways into violent extremism and ultimately to be better equipped to prevent and disrupt similar cases. The case study that I picked for today is about the founder of one of the most dangerous and largest NVE groups out there named 764. So let's go back a couple of years. In 2023, a 17-year-old from Texas was sentenced to 80 years in prison for the crimes he committed from the bedroom in his mother's house. It turned out he had founded an international violent extremist online network that systematically targets and victimizes children and young people using social media and popular gaming platforms. Through coordinated sextortion and coercion, the group exploits some of the most vulnerable people in our society to engage in escalating violent acts. So, for example, within these groups, kids are coerced into producing child sexual abuse material, engaging in self-harm, and carrying out acts of animal abuse and violence against others. And in the most extreme cases, we have seen kids being coerced into live streaming their own suicide. So cases like this leave people shocked, and we probably all ask the same question: how did we get here? How does a 15-year-old engage in such horrific crimes and creates such a dangerous online network, one that still continues to exist even after he's been placed behind bars? So when we looked into his case files, what we could see right away was that he didn't have a normal childhood. We saw that he grew up with a lot of instability and neglect at home. He was exposed to violence from a young age, and he experienced severe mental health difficulties, engaged in self-harm, had serious behavioral problems, including aggression and delinquency. He was also severely bullied and excluded by peers. Then, in addition to all of that, he was exposed to pornography by a friend at around age 7. Around age 10, he was then introduced by other peers to violent torture and gore videos. And really, what we could see is like the more he watched those videos and he reported that, the less shocking it felt and the more desensitized he became. So eventually he made threats, he got excluded from school. And really what one of the turning points was that kind of exclusion from school that he experienced, because that really growing isolation from the offline world when he spent like weeks unsupervised online, hardly leaving his room, really like intensified his fascination with violence. Over time, while he was in these like forum and violent forums, he started posting and sharing violent material himself. And importantly, he said he found attention and sense of belonging that he was unable to experience in the offline world. And I mean, really, it didn't stop there. Over time, from like watching those extreme contents, he went on to actively exploiting and coercing minors, and he eventually created 764. So very chaotic slide, and that's on purpose. So while parts of this network operate in the US, 764 and other groups are not just a US problem. We know that NVE groups are a transnational threat with members and victims spread across North America, Europe, Australia, and beyond. In fact, in December 2025, Canada and New Zealand became the first countries to officially designate NVE groups as terrorist entities, underscoring just how serious and global this threat has become. So what exactly is NVE and what makes an offender nihilistic violent extremist? The issue we have when studying this emerging threat that is so rapidly evolving is that there's no agreed definition or label, at least internationally. Despite the fact that these groups operate across different continents, and a perpetrator based in Europe might be coercing a victim in the US and vice versa. So that really creates a range of problems for researchers when trying to take a systematic look at NVE. For example, common labels of capturing this new trend include nihilistic violent extremism. Some call them the violent com. Other countries label a subset of those offenders violent fascinated people. And luckily, we don't have to solve the issue of finding a shared definition today, but it is definitely something we should keep in mind when researching about NVE. What we do know about these offenders is that they're situated within a decentralized transnational online network called the COM. Within the COM, 3 main pillars have been identified, namely hacker or cybercom, then second, sextortion com, and then third, offline or in real life com. We also know some of the main tactics these offenders use and the main online spaces they use to groom, recruit, and victimize their victims. In terms of what is unknown, well, a lot is unknown, that's for sure. But I hope by the end of today's webinar, a little bit less will be unknown. And yeah, that's what we are trying to achieve today. So while we acknowledge that like other research teams internationally and in the US might use different definitions and inclusion criteria, it's important to mention how we decided whether a case presents or meets our NVE conceptualization or not. So we're a US-based center, so we started using a working definition by the US government. And we reviewed individuals charged as NVE in the US to help refine the construct. So the main groups charged as NVE in the US are 764, Craigie's Cult, and Cult, which mainly fall within the sextortion pillar of the COM. However, we then extended our scope to also include other groups commonly labeled as being part of the violent COM. So in addition to the sextortion COM groups, we also include offline or in real life COM groups such as Maniac Murder Cult, No Lives Matter, and others. So when looking at NVE research, we all know there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, whereas systematic research really is still pretty limited. For example, we don't really understand the pathways into NVE groups, such as who are those individuals and why they're doing what they do. What are, for example, the life course factors that might help explain or better understand why and how they ended up becoming involved in these NVE groups? Or we also don't know much about the motivational drivers. For example, how much of a role does ideology really play here? And what other factors might drive these horrific crimes? And really to answer some of those research questions, we created a novel data set that I will explain in more detail over the next couple of slides. So the novel data set is compiled and hosted by Insight as part of the Youth Mobilization to Violent Extremism project. The dataset focuses on nihilistic violent extremism and includes offenders associated with NVE and violent online COM groups. So we exclude offenders that exclusively sit within the hacker COM, but we include sextortion and offline COM affiliated offenders. The information for coding is systematically collected from all available media and research reports, for which we use open source databases such as LexisNexis and Google News. And for our US cases, there's a strong focus on pulling and coding all relevant federal and state court records. As mentioned earlier, and I need to give him a special shout out again, in order to get access to these court records, we closely work with Seamus Hughes, who help us identify new cases and pulls the relevant documents for us. And this is just so incredibly important to our research, as those rich, in-depth court records enable us to do the coding on the life course factors. We have no age or location restrictions, so the database includes information on all international known offenders associated with NVE and other violent COM groups. However, we only include cases, and that's important to mention, we only include and code cases for which sufficient sources have been identified to enable the type of in-depth coding our dataset is built upon. So if we can't identify offender's full name, or we only have a limited amount of information on what they did or on other several categories of indicators, we exclude them for now and keep them in a separate file until more information becomes available and we can finally code them. Our database, for that reason, is continuously updated as new cases emerge, and as such, it gives us the most current picture of how this threat really is evolving. In terms of the coding, so each case is double-coded, so with two coders, and then it's reconciled by a third coder for quality assurance. All coders received weeks and months of extensive coding training and regular feedback on their coding assignments. Missing data, we have to mention it, is always a challenge when coding open source data due to varying levels of information available for different cases. So it's hard to tell what information is not available because there is not enough resources, and what is missing, actually missing, or it's just not present. So for variables where we had or cases where we had a lot of missing values, we excluded them from the analysis rather than impute missing values. So overall, the database includes over 400 indicators. It's a very large code book, capturing extensive information on the background characteristics, life course factors, mobilization indicators, motivational drivers, and types of online and offline harms committed by individuals in NVE groups. The code book draws on existing code books on lone actor terrorism by Paul Gill and colleagues, Grievance Fueled Violence by Emily Corner and colleagues, Susceptibility to Violent Extremism by the co-PI of this project, Caitlin Clemmer, and other existing databases such as Pyrus. Due to the new tactics used and harms enacted by NVE groups, we also conducted an inductive coding process reviewing case information to come up with new indicators. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to go in depth into all the indicators we measured, but I hope that the results presented in a moment will provide you with more information about this. So finally, let's start with our descriptive results. So as of today, we have 75 cases fully coded that met our inclusion criteria and where we had enough information to reliably code the types of harms and crimes they engaged in. Out of the 75 cases, 36 cases had enough information that allowed us to code life course factors. Overall, we have offenders from 16 different countries in our data set, 74% so far based in the US. So this is only what we have in our data set, and this should not be used as a number of where the majority of NVE offenders are based. Our high US numbers are because of several reasons. First, we started coding US cases because we're US based. Second, because of our access to US federal court records, we had evidence of who is clearly labeled as an NVE. And third, and that is very important, our coding, as I said, is heavily skewed towards having access to either court records or other types of rich open source information. And for a lot of the international offenders, we don't have enough information to do that type of coding. 77% of offenders in our data set are based in the extortion com. Again, the number is high due to our US definition of NVE, which mainly includes people in the extortion com. 23% are part of the offline com, and we really expect that number to go up as we start coding our true crime community cases and other offline com offenders, which we already have identified, but we haven't coded yet. And 21 years of age was the average age at arrest. The actual average age of offending is likely much younger. However, usually you only get charged federally at a certain age, so it skews towards like higher, older ages. And so far, all of our offenders are male. However, we have already identified some female NVEs, which we just haven't coded yet. And the results presented in a minute are based on 36 cases where we have enough sources to do the type of coding. So for almost all of them, we have hundreds and for some thousands of pages of court records and news records to enable that in-depth live course coding. So first, we analyzed early adversity and family instability constructs. Here, we coded, for example, evidence of childhood trauma, domestic abuse, neglect, safeguarding involvement, significant instability growing up, caregiver loss, or disrupted attachment. And for example, 62 of offenders experienced childhood trauma. 42% had significant stability in their life when growing up as a minor. And 31% were the victim of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse by a caregiver as a minor. We also looked at mental health conditions, self-harm, suicidality, and neurodivergence. 69% of offenders showed evidence of diagnosed or suspected mental health conditions, self-harm, or suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. If we break this down, we see that 58% had a diagnosed or suspected mental health condition, 42 either engaged in self-harm or were suicidal, 27 had a diagnosed or suspected neurodevelopmental condition, and 19% were either diagnosed or suspected to have autism. While these numbers are much higher than what we see in the general population, they are likely much lower than what truly is the case, given that we rely on what is reported in court records and open source data, and they likely tend to underreport those types of things. Given that most offenders are minors or young adults, we also coded for school disengagement and difficulties within the school setting. So for example, 46% of offenders showed significant behavioral issues at school, 31% were expelled, and 31% dropped out of school. Similarly, peer and other social relationships are key during adolescence and early adulthood. And together with school disengagement, a lack of those can indicate reduced protective offline bonds and supervision. So for example, we saw that 73% showed offline relationship difficulties, which meant there was evidence of either persistent difficulty maintaining or forming social relationships, peer rejection, or social isolation. We could also see then, if we practice further down, we saw that 50% had a lack of pro-social relationships, 46% felt rejected, were excluded or bullied by peers, and 27% showed a pattern of persistent conflict behavior across relationships. We also reviewed early transgressive or harmful behavior, so prior to their engagement in violent extremism. We saw that 77% engaged in some sort of rule-breaking behavior, which included communicating violent threats, youth or police or youth justice contact for harmful conduct, any crimes they committed against people or property, serious bullying perpetration, or illegal alcohol or substance use. 58% of those people, 58% overall engaged in prior offending. So any crimes they committed against people or property, as well as any arrest charges, convictions were coded here. We could see also that 24% engage in harmful behavior driven by low self-control, which could include thrill or sensation-seeking behaviors, risk-seeking behaviors, or impulsive behaviors. We could also see that 15% showed problematic substance use. And interestingly, and this is very shocking too, is that 50% of offenders had experienced previous physical, sexual, or serious emotional victimization as a child or adolescent, either from a caregiver or someone outside the family. We also looked at a range of beliefs and attitudes which are commonly present among other violent extremist offenders. So for example, we could see that 40% of offenders were driven by a private or public grievance, 27% held conspiracy beliefs, 24% experienced an injustice either personally or on behalf of their group, and 15% experienced either threats to themselves or their in-group. So one of our key research questions looks at the motivations for the NVE-related offenses they committed. In total, we coded over 20 potential motivational drivers, and offenders could present with multiple motivations. The most important motivational driver in our data, with 77%, was the desire for notoriety. This was followed by a fascination with violence, which almost 2/3 of offenders showed. The third most common, with 62%, was sadism, which was operationalized as cruelty for pleasure or enjoyment of others' suffering, including animals. 46% of cases seem to be status-driven. 42% had a desire for power or control. And interestingly, but not unexpected, ideological motivations seem to be less of a meaningful driver than more personal or inward-facing needs, with 42% as well. Then when looking at belonging and connection, we saw that 23% of people had that. And despite the vast majority of offenses involving the distribution and possession of child sexual abuse material, sexual gratification actually did not seem to be a very prominent driver. So we also looked at the types of online platforms where we could find evidence that either victims had been groomed, were recruited, or victimized. And we saw that 85% of victimization happened over voice over internet protocol platforms such as Discord, Telegram, Kik, Signal, and other servers and channels. Again, these numbers are likely underreporting the actual extent. 46% of offenders in our data set held a leadership role in an NVE community compared to being just a member. So leadership was coded as evidence of being a founder of an NVE channel or group, or holding a recognized status or authority role, such as being a moderator or administrator that controls access to channels. Then 54% were part of different pillars, which meant that they were involved in the sextortion and offline groups, such as, for example, being involved in 764 and No Lives Matter. And then 19% were part of multiple extreme groups or networks with different ideologies, such as, for example, being involved in 764 and incel forums. So moving on to the NVE-related offending, we found evidence of 50% of people in our data set had either planned or executed offline violence against people or property and as part of their involvement in NVE groups. 54% of offenders engaged also in cyber offenses such as doxing, squatting, hacking, or cyberstalking. 54% communicated violent threats. 19% had obtained weapons for the planned or executed attack, and 90% possessed illegal firearms. So we coded many more extremist behaviors that they could engage in. I think in total we have like close to 40 indicators, but because of time constraints, I only picked a few for today. We also coded for many more, actually, than you can see on the slide, NVE-specific online indicators across both perpetrators and victims. Today, I'll only focus on a few of the harms, and I'll only report the findings for the perpetrators, not for the victims. So, for example, we coded the types of content offenders possessed or distributed. And we could see that 85% of offenders either possessed or distributed extremist content, 69% possessed gore content, whereas we could see that 65% of offenders had distributed or possessed child sexual abuse material, and 39% were related to animal abuse content. So we also then coded production. So production typically either involved the offenders engaging in the harm themselves or via coercion, which meant they coerced, manipulated, or blackmailed a victim to engage in those types of harms in order to produce the material that could then be shared within the network. For example, we could see that 65% of offenders produce gore content. This could include severe self-harm they coerced victims to engage in, such as cut signs and other violent behaviors. We saw that 58% of offenders produced extremist content, and 46 produced child sexual abuse material, either via contact with the victim, so they actually abused the victim, or via coercion, so they blackmailed or threatened the victim to engage in sexually explicit act and to film the material that then could be shared within the network. And we could see that 19% either produced animal abuse content, that 90% produced animal content either by abusing the animals themselves or via coercion, where they got a victim to engage in the abuse. I think I'm actually quite good in time. Implications, discussions, and next steps. So we are still at the early stages of understanding the emerging NVE threat. And some of the findings, hopefully today, help us better understand who these individuals are, and most importantly, what sets them on the path of becoming involved in NVE groups. It's important to mention that the results today are based on our own NVE inclusion criteria and our coding. And as I said earlier, we have coded for over 400 plus indicators. I only presented around 60 today. And the fact that we have such high rates of early instability and trauma, previous victimization, mental health difficulties, early problem behavior, and offline disconnection really requires trauma-informed, early preventative, and multi-agency efforts to tackle that threat. So building resilience against some of those vulnerabilities, such as within a public health framework to preventing a range of harms, may increase resilience against involvement in NVE groups. And really, due to the rapid growth in offending and victimization of NVE groups globally, there's a need for developing a shared understanding of what NVE is and what is not NVE, as well as increased cooperation of international partners across research and practice. Our next steps here at Insight involve ongoing coding as new cases emerge, as well as where we have ongoing trials, updating already coded cases when more court records and other sources become available. We also continue our coding of offenders situated within the offline com, such as those within the true crime communities and other offenders that meet our inclusion criteria. And we will increasingly focus also on coding non-US cases as they emerge. Over the year, we have a lot more to do. Over the course of the year, we will compare our NVE offenders to other violent extremist offenders, such as Salafi jihadists, accelerationists, and violent incels that are part of our NSAID youth mobilization data set. And that will really help us to allow whether they're unique or shared indicators and pathways, and it will help us distinguish what actually constitutes NVE and what does not. And lastly, we have a strong focus on producing end-user outputs. So the goal is really to translate the most rigorous science that we can produce into guidance documents and training for law enforcement and practitioners. And I mean, we have so many other ongoing analyses that I didn't have time to present today, like, for example, comparing online versus offline offenders, comparing leaders to non-leaders. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have enough time, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Bettina. That was an excellent presentation and a presentation of an incredibly useful, enriched data set and database. You mentioned that there's a lot of other work being done. Could you tell the folks on the panel where they might be able to find some of that? Would they be looking at the NSIGHT website to see some of those other products that you were mentioning?
Give me 1 second. I actually accidentally unshared and I wanted to keep the slide up.
Well, we can see that slide. So we've
perfect. So
yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I mean, we have a lot of ongoing research. We are also currently working towards releasing an NVE series because we have so many different like in-depth qualitative coding, quantitative coding. So over the next couple of weeks, we will release several like short research brief, 2 to 5 pages on our website that can be accessed by people. I hope you can maybe put like the NSIGHT link into the chat. And as research emerges, we usually always try to produce these short 2 to 5 pages that give people early access to what we are finding while our academic papers are under review. This is kind of our goal. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a lot more research products on our website very soon.
Excellent. So we've got time for questions. We have about 20 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, you can see the Q&A function in the Zoom chat. And if you could put your questions in there, we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And already we have many coming in. We've got a couple of questions about ideology and coding for ideology. So there are questions about how you coded for it. And more specifically, we've got a question from Kurt Braddock asking if ideology is inconclusive as a motivating factor for NVE-related attacks. If not having evidence of ideology as a motivating factor is not present, to what degree then should we call it terrorism? And then there's other questions around ideology, which if ideology was present, could you expand a little bit about which were the most common or prolific ideologies that were present in that data set?
Thanks, Brad, for giving me the $1 million question. Right, I'll try to answer that. So we measured ideology, whether it was evidence of like a sustained ideological commitment. So what we see typically with a lot of the NVE offenders is that they use extremist aesthetics as part of like their recruitment propaganda and within their videos that they share. If someone just shared a Nazi flag in the background, that was not enough for us to say this person has extremist beliefs. However, when extremist beliefs were stated, so for example, they had like grievances or conspiracy beliefs related to like anti-Semitism or the white genocide, things like that. When there was any like mentioning of extremist statements, we coded that as yes. But just having like some sort of like Nazi flag or symbols in the background, some of those aesthetics was not on its own enough to say they were motivated by ideology. However, what we did see when ideology was a motivating factor, it was usually neo-Nazism. There was like a lot of Order of Nine Angles influences, a lot of accelerationist influences. So those were kind of the most common types that we could see in our data. Not sure if I answered everything, or there's like probably more follow-ups.
There is lots of questions about ideology, but also many more coming in. Can you also expand a little bit about what technologies you felt were central to facilitating NVE? Was there particular platforms or particular technologies that were more prevalent in the online space?
Yeah, so the voice over internet protocol platforms like Telegram, and those were like key to facilitating it. Interestingly, the number that we found like gaming platforms being involved was much lower than what we expected. However, we always have to say we rely on what is reported in open source data. So what is reported in news articles, what is reported in gaming platforms. And it might be the case that they might have been like recruited or first contacted on gaming platforms, but then they moved to like other more secure platforms. For that reason, those gaming platforms might not be mentioned. I mean, when gaming platforms were mentioned, there was like Discord was mentioned. When we had also a lot of social media platforms. I mean, I can go back to the slide actually. That were present, but yeah, most of the platforms or types that were mentioned were the voice over internet protocol platforms. But again, that they might be recruited on other things, it's just not reported. And yeah, with mainstream social media, we had like Instagram and loads of others.
And there was a question also about these mainstream platforms. Did you find TikTok being used as well here? One of the questioners is asking.
Yeah, it was used. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have like in another output coming out soon, we will have the percentages exactly of how often was TikTok mentioned, how often was Instagram mentioned, how often was Facebook mentioned. But yeah, here you just see like more the overarching breakdown. But yes, that will definitely be something that we will publish very soon. But again, I always want to just caution, it's like what is mentioned and what is actually used might be a different thing.
Yes. We've also got a couple of questions about the intersection between NVE and this new nihilism, and asking whether you were seeing intersections between this global trend toward nihilism, and if you're seeing any correlations or connections there.
I mean, nihilism in terms of like violence fascinated people, like driven by.
Well,
is there any more?
Asks, there's been a growing and significant global shift toward nihilism. This shift is marked by a rejection of traditional milestones and a lived attitude, which is influenced by economic, environment, and political anxiety. This trend is known as novo nihilism, and so they were asking whether you've seen some connections there.
We have not seen any specific connections in our data. However, what we do see, I mean, we see a lot of the vulnerabilities of the things that make young people vulnerable are not really new. What we see is really new is like the opportunities, how you can target and can recruit people online. So I think that is probably one of the main shifts that we're seeing. That's why we're also seeing much younger people being involved, not of them necessarily being more vulnerable, which could be a case, but it's so much easier to like find, recruit, target young kids by them being online.
Yep. So that's actually a good follow-up or segue to other questioners who've asked that, as you said, that there are common vulnerabilities that you found. Is there some particular vulnerability or other factor that pushes people toward this particular type of involvement versus other violent extremism or antisocial behaviors? Is there, because of the commonalities in terms of vulnerabilities are across the board, is there anything particular that you're seeing that would draw these people to NVE type of actions?
I will actually go to a slide that I couldn't present because I thought I didn't have time. What we did was like comparing NVE online and offline offenders. So really those people who mainly engage in the sextortion, coercion of victims, which is like a new tactic that we're seeing, compared to those people who go out to targeted like offline attacks, whether it's against people or property. So what we could really see is like that the motivation amongst those people is different. So we see, for example, that ideology, grievance, significance, moral superiority are much more important amongst those more who engage more in those like traditional types of violent extremist crimes, which tended to happen offline. However, we see with online offenders that power, sadism, belonging, and financial means seem to be much more important. When we really look at their life course factors, and I think this is the key here, we see that those who engage in the online harms were significantly more likely to experience childhood adversity, previous general victimization, and especially were significantly more likely to experience previous sexual victimization as a minor. And I feel that maybe differentiates those types of like new types of offenders that we see that mainly stay within the online world compared to maybe those who engage in offline violence, for example, seeing extremist beliefs being more important, revenge ideation and perceived injustices, conspiracy theories and stuff like that. So I think the victimization, especially victimization from a young age, and a lot of that early trauma and childhood adversity, I think is something that potentially sets them on a different path.
So that points us to a question that was asked. Tony Stanley asks if you could tell us more about the role and influence in place of family and siblings. So if they're experiencing greater childhood trauma or victimization, perhaps the family and siblings have a role in that. But then do you also see family as a possibility in kind of off-ramping people out of NVE as well?
Yes, I mean, we know that pro-social relationships can be some of the strongest protective factors that we have. I mean, amongst most of our cases, there was some sort of childhood trauma, some sort of disruptive care, or like neglect from parents and caregivers. So we do see that this is a massive risk factor. We also know, on the other hand, that pro-social relationships, especially within the home and when they're minors, are very important. So like early preventative approaches should really work with parents and should strengthen those protective bonds. But it goes much further than just the family. I think also the school context is really important, but because what we've seen, what tipped most of them over was when they got expelled from school, when they dropped out, that usually left them within that vacuum of like lack of supervision, lack of pro-social bonds. They spent more time online, and I think things go downwards from there on.
So you mentioned ideology present in some of the cases, but also conspiracy theories. So a couple of questions have asked about just asking you for a little bit more detail about what type of conspiracy theories you see folks embrace.
Yes, so that's actually like one of my previous research focuses was on conspiracy theories. So like I did a deep dive into it. By far, most of them are anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, also general like Jewish conspiracy theories, but also really like great replacement, like white people being replaced by immigrants, and it's all the Jews who are conspiring to do that. That is by far number one. Type of conspiracy beliefs that was present. Some of them, but that often like correlated heavily with like having paranoia and delusions. Some of them also had some anti-government conspiracy beliefs, but mainly it was more like those types of conspiracy beliefs that you see more on the far-right extremist spectrum.
And there are a couple of questions as well about the connections between, say, misogyny, or if there are any overlaps and you're seeing in online NVE spaces in the manosphere.
Yeah, interesting. So we also coded for misogyny, and we had different misogyny codes. So from like misogynistic behaviors to like slurs to like wanting to police women. So a lot of different indicators. It's hard to tell because what we're really seeing here is almost, at least in our data set, it's almost predominantly males victimizing females. I mean, we know there's also female perpetrators. We also know that there is like male victims, but it's very often males victimizing girls, females. And a lot of the current victimization involves child sexual abuse material. So in and of itself, you could say these are misogynistic crimes. It's men targeting women for like sexual purposes. So it's hard from what we've seen. We do see that, especially within the cases where there is like sexual gratification was more of a motivator, we saw that those cases more heavily overlap with misogyny. We also saw that some of the perpetrators had been also involved in incel forums. But we couldn't see like across a lot of the cases like a clear overlap, okay, between misogyny and incels. There was like across, I mean, right now, really in-depth coding has only been conducted on like 36 cases. As new cases emerge, I'm sure we'll see more. But what we did see was like people having those misogynistic beliefs and attitudes, and also having that sexual gratification. That was definitely like something that correlated.
And what about the presence of firearms? So that's something that you've coded for. So there were a couple of questions around that. So one of them is illegal versus legally procured firearms, if that's something that if you coded very specifically for that in terms of offline. And then if you're seeing more of a presence or risk for 3D printed firearms.
So yes, I mean, everyone knows access to weapons is different in the US to other countries. So just possessing weapons wasn't an indicator of enough, because like you're allowed to have weapons in the US. So what we did, we really coded for like illegal possession of firearms, where it was clear evidence they were not allowed to have firearms. The thing was like a lot of the people who were engaging in online and offline violence had legal firearms. We didn't code them only when it was clear that they illegally possessed them. So yeah, that was a clear distinction. And in terms of 3D printed guns, we haven't seen anything in our data so far. But it's for sure something that I think we'll see more as we code more cases.
So you mentioned in terms of some of the responses to this problem set, a lot of it is in the preventative space, so youth, early childhood, but we've had a couple of questions around the intervention possibilities. So some colleagues in New Zealand have asked in the questions that they're dealing with some cases of those already involved in this milieu. And what are you seeing is potentially kind of effective intervention or drawing people out of these spaces when they're already in them?
So yeah, I mean, there's hardly any research yet conducted. I know that colleagues in Canada working on interventions, getting people out of it. However, we have fairly limited research, especially once they're like deeply immersed into these networks, once they have produced certain child sexual abuse material and things like that. I mean, it gets harder and harder. What probably is much more effective is like early preventative approaches. So kind of trying to disrupt the pathway to involvement in NVE groups. So trying to work on some of these underlying susceptibilities and vulnerabilities that make someone more likely to join those groups. I mean, once they're in the groups, I'm not saying there's nothing that can be done, but first it's also really hard, like, because the more crimes they perpetrate, like the more status they get within the group, in the more like secure and like closed off channels they can participate in. And it gets harder and harder for law enforcement, intelligence agencies as well to infiltrate those groups, because you can't just hang out in these groups. Usually you need to provide, especially the very exclusive channels, you need to provide some sort of like evidence of involvement too, which makes it really hard. So I mean, that is probably more a question that law enforcement and intelligence agencies should answer. But I think early preventative approaches are key here, because we do see, really, when we look at the life course, it starts off with a very disrupted family environment. Then there's like peer issues, mental health difficulties, and also really like there's a lot of observable indicators that teachers, parents, and people in the community can spot. And I think really those observable indicators are the ones that we need to focus on and try to identify cases before they actually become involved.
We also have some questions about the intersection or potential overlaps with other types of ideological motivations. So there's one question from Andrew Zamet asking about the comparing the NVE cases to an accelerationist case or data sets. So have you found that there's kind of like an overlap between accelerationist or NVE between those, and did you find it difficult to differentiate?
So just to make clear, and I know people have different NVE definitions, we do not include accelerationists in our NVE database. Here at Insight, we are also building a much larger youth mobilization to violent extremism database, where we have a lot of accelerationists in the data set. We've just started the coding. It includes like people in the US under the age 25 and younger. What we've seen so far from looking at case studies, yes, there are overlaps, as we would expect with violent extremists. However, a lot of the tactics and offending and motivations seem to differ. Probably not for all of the cases, and that is very anecdotal evidence. But this is really what I said at the end of my slide in like next steps. This is really what we want to find out. What are the common like overlaps or really like distinctions between NVEs and, for example, violent incels and accelerationists? And are they really there? Or maybe they're more similar than we think they are, or they're more different. But it's like, I think only really a lot of like rigorous, systematic, empirical research can answer that question. So I hope by the end of the year, we can tell you more about that.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, people are asking, like, if you think that involvement in NVE can provide a recruitment pathway for other extremist or terrorist groups in terms of identifying potential candidates. Is that something that you
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's why we actually coded whether they were involved in different violent extremist online groups. So not just within the com, if they're involved in like offline com and sextortion com, but also if they were, for example, involved in like violent incel forums or far-right extremist forums and NVE forums. And we could see that several of those were. And obviously, once they share the same spaces, often like they also come together on like Go forums that are not necessarily like NVE forums, but where a lot of like different violent extremists and NVEs come together. And whenever like those people get together in one space, even if that's a physical, like an online virtual space, there's always the risk of recruitment towards other types. Because a lot of these kids are young, they're highly vulnerable. There's a lot of like peer pressure and a need for validation, belonging. And those people know how to exploit those vulnerabilities and to recruit those people. So yeah, the fact that we're dealing with such a young population of offenders or potential offenders just makes it even more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bettina. So speaking of the offending, there's a question about in the offline offending that you found. Did you find that the subjects tended to act alone or in groups or join with others?
Actually, let's go back to that. I'm not sure if I have something on the slide. No, I haven't. Most of them acted on their own. Yeah. There was most of them didn't have a conspiracy charge either.
Yeah. So we're coming close to time, but we've got a number of other questions. So for folks who want to stay on a little bit longer, we might just extend for another few minutes to answer some of these excellent questions that are coming in, because clearly there's lots of interest in this terrific work that you're doing, but we understand if people do need to head off soon, but we'll try to get to a couple of more questions there because I think they're quite relevant and can offer us a bit of
Could I actually also make a quick advertisement about our working groups? So we actually have like very soon working groups coming up on youth mobilization and on NVE across the Five Eyes, where we bring together practitioners, anyone working within the CT space, looking at use cases or NVE cases. So if you're interested in taking part, you will get early access to a lot of the materials and also more access than we will share with the public. You can sign up either my email address or the email address here on the slide. So just if like any practitioners are interested in that. And we hold them across the Five Eyes, different time zones. So you don't need to get up in the middle of the night. Thank you.
That's always good for us, though.
Yeah, because the UK people, they're asleep now. So yeah.
Yes. No, that's terrific. Thanks, Bettina. I know it's a kind of a problem set that lots of us are concerned about. And it's great
exactly.
to have this opportunities for collaboration. I might take one or two more questions and then
Sure.
unfortunately have to wrap it up, but thank you for providing your contact information and people can follow up with Bettina and the team
Sure.
afterward.
Of course.
One of the questions I thought that was particularly interesting and a specific one was around the mental health coding. Were those coded toward the DSM?
Yes. So that's actually like we had a lot of back and forth. So it was adapted from my colleague, Caitlin Clemmer, who has done a lot of research on mental health. Initially, we had like a much larger codebook set of items. We then kind of reduced it down to like diagnosed or suspected mental health condition, where actually it was mentioned in the court records. He was diagnosed with autism, or there was like a report where they said they suspected he has autism. So we really tried to, it's a very stringent inclusion criteria because we looked for some of the kind of like the traits of behavior they presented with, but usually we just like, if there was mentioning of the condition, we coded it just to be sure not to over-report anything. We likely under-report now, that's for sure. But we'd rather like to see where there's actual evidence compared to what is just like what we think the data tells us.
Yeah. We also have a question about the coding taxonomy, and you mentioned the working groups that you're putting together, but is there a coding taxonomy that others can use for consistency with your data set?
Yes. So first we need to get our outputs together. And then we likely, once we've run our analyses, make the codebook available. But I don't know when that will happen.
Okay, well, it'll.
But anyone who wants to know anything can send me an email. We are usually always happy to collaborate.
Excellent. Well, I think that might be kind of a good note to end on. I know we've had many more questions, but Bettina has very generously offered to stay in touch, and you can reach out directly. Be sure to register your interest in the working groups if that's something that you would find useful. And just a big thank you again to Dr. Bettina Rottweiler and Sarah Vetter and the Insight team for this fantastic research and for sharing it with us through this AVERT webinar. We'll be sending through additional information about our upcoming AVERT webinars very soon. You can always find out more and keep up to date by joining our mailing list through the AVERT website, avert.net.au, and following us on LinkedIn. You can also keep up to date on lots of our activities and upcoming webinars, so be sure to sign up. So with that, another big thank you to the both of you, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us and joining. Thank you.
Thank you.